This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Storyworks Roundtable. We are talking about setting. That's a big topic, and we're just going general with it. And as we get rolling, I'm sure we'll drill down into a topic or two. So to begin with, what is it and why do you need it? Well, I think there's going to be some editing.
It seems obvious, but it's like essential.
Well, yeah, it is essential, which is what makes it obvious. So if you think of... Oh, Robert's looking very deadpan right now. Kathryn and I are punchy. Okay. Something I introduced in the character book is applying the 5 W's in the H of journalism to your fiction writing, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so setting is the when and the where. And that's just a really straightforward way to think of it. You can't have a story occur in a vacuum. It has to take place at a time and in a specific place. So simple, right? When and where. What makes setting hard? What challenges do you face when you think of your setting?
Well, I suppose I like to think of it as you cannot not have a setting. I mean, there is going to be one no matter what. So even if you say, oh, no, but it's just my characters and they're just talking to each other. Well, okay, then the very lack of any defined space means that the reader is going to make up that they're on a blank stage, or they're in a room with no furniture, or they're in space, or so there is always going to be a setting because the reader is going to imagine one.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's the way I like to think about it. And I know for me, it's often when I haven't taken enough effort to give some specifics for the reader to hang their hat on, then when I read it, or if a beta reader reads it, they come back and they say, but I didn't really quite understand when they went from the elevator over into the shopping mall. How did they get there? You go, oh yeah, okay, I didn't really think that through, did I? And so sometimes it's because specifics are lacking, which is quite interesting because you think setting's such a broad thing. Oh yeah, it's this massive world that's out way beyond our solar system, but it's still got to have specifics.
Mm-hmm. Right, very true. Kathryn, what problems do you encounter when you think of setting?
I think I have more issues with time than I do with space. Because I will tend to imagine a pretty rich, colorful world. No problem. Like, I'll drop my characters in and they'll be great. And then it's like, how much time has passed? 10 minutes, 10 days? Like, that's where I start struggling with, scene to scene, or even within a scene. That couldn't have taken the hours that it needed to take in order for, so those are I tend to struggle more with time than the actual location.
Interesting. Yeah. So as an editor, I find a lot of people drop their setting off the page. So I've taken to calling that green screen writing. So you'll introduce a scene,
that's nice.
And there's something of a setting, some sort of place or description around the characters. And then the characters turn into talking heads. And it's the world around them just vanished, and we need somebody to come in and drop another layer behind them on the green screen to give us some texture and a sense of context, because really your setting is your context. As we sit here now, we can see the walls behind each other. We can see the pictures we have hanging on the walls. We can see the microphones. We know there's a computer in front of us that we're looking at. So visually, and anyone watching the video on YouTube, you get a sense of us in our environments, even though, our walls are all pretty white. Right now, that just happens to be that way.
Pretty bland.
But if you're listening to the podcast, then you just get the voices in your ears. But when you're reading a story, you expect the world, you expect a visual sensory experience, and you can't limit that to one thing, like the auditory experience of dialogue, So, yeah.
Right. I think we talked about this a bit when we talked about dialogue and action beats, and how you kind of have to strike that balance between narrative exposition, what's going on behind your character, and the dialogue the character's speaking, and not have it tip one direction or the other.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I do. I know in first draft writing, I miss setting and description, and I know it's something that I have to look for and go back in revision and make sure. I think partly because, with our visual, auditory, and kinesthetic preferences, I'm definitely more visual. So when I'm writing first draft, that there is definitely a movie in the head, and the problem with that is that you've got this very rich setting in your head, and you write so fast that it doesn't translate into what the words are on the paper. But when you read it back as a writer, you think, oh no, that's fine. I know exactly what's going on there, because you've matched it back to that movie in your head again. And it's really tricky to put yourself back in the reader's seat and think, okay, is there enough in there that they can picture this if they're, or that they can hear it if they're auditory, or that they can get a sense of it if they've got a more kinesthetic, reading process. Right. So I do think that helps. And the other thing I think is is this whole know thyself thing, where in neurolinguistics we talk about primary metaprogram filters, which is people, place, things, information, and activity. And so if you're writing and your primary filter is through people, then chances are you are going to have lots of talking head in your first draft, because you're naturally, as a person, not necessarily attracted to, say, information or place. And so I think it helps to go back and comb through your draft from those 5 different filters and say, okay, is there a balance here between people, place, activity, things, information? Because every reader is going to have some makeup within those primary filters.
Right. Okay, you just said 2 different things that are both really interesting. And the first one was the point you were making about how you set up the movie in your own mind, and then it doesn't always get on the page. And I think that's why we end up with the green screen writing, and why writers will introduce a setting but then forget about it. Because the movie's playing in your head, but it's not playing in the reader's head. So as you go through and revise, you've got to try to step back. And this is why resting manuscripts is so useful. Step back and try to be the reader and not the author. Separate yourself from the movie that you're trying to, transcribe onto the page, and experience what's on the page for what it is, so that you can then see where to put in those details. And then the other thing, Robert, you were talking about is so interesting, because, if you're a very visual person or a very auditory or tactile person, your manuscript might be kind of heavy on those types of details, but lacking in some of the other details. Can you tell us again what all of those different labels were, and maybe expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I suppose the thing that people are most familiar with is, are we most likely to process things visually, auditorily, or kinesthetic, meaning, as you say, it can be tactile, but it also can be sensation, and it can be proprioceptive, meaning where you feel your body is in space. So some people, usually we have a preference, and obviously we all use all of our senses for the most part, unless we've got some kind of disability. So we're likely to have a preference, and usually that's most noticeable in how we internally process our thoughts. So if you're used to thinking things through and you can see lots of images, then chances are you have a primary preference of visual. If you're used to talking to yourself, or you hear a lot of music in your head, which is different to words in your head, then that can be an auditory preference. And so for people who are very word heavy, so they might love text, for example, then that's a subset of auditory, which is auditory words or textual. And so they might love writing dialogue, because to them that's the real where where the world is richest. And for people who have a very strong kinesthetic sense, that it could be emotional, it could be tactile, it could be action beats. So there's a few subdivisions of that one, where your preferences might lie in being therefore descriptive of things that are rich in either emotion or touch and feel, or in some kind of movement.
Right.
So does that make sense in those three?
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting to think of our writing that way, and you can be leaning toward one thing as a style choice and as part of your voice, but you also don't want to leave, 2/3 of your readers in the cold because you're ignoring the other areas. So you want to find that balance, but it doesn't mean you have to be equally divided between all of those arenas. It just means don't neglect any in favor of just one or two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's some scene appropriate leanings there as well. So quite, obviously, if you're describing a love scene, then you aren't necessarily going to go to in-depth visuals. I'm talking, a clean romance. It's probably more going to be focused around the internal feelings, sensations, and maybe even words, mood, that kind of thing. Whereas if I'm describing a fairly galactic-wide spaceship battle, then I'm probably going to choose some visual elements to try and get that into the reader's head. And a lot of auditory elements as well. If you think of like a battle scene in a movie and how loud those are with lots of explosions and gunfire or screaming, or so that's really interesting point too, that your characters are going to be doing something, a certain, the action of that scene, and it's going to be in a setting relevant to that action. And so the types of details that you bring to life for the reader should be appropriate, not only to the setting. A hospital will have a very different set of setting details than a forest or than a superhighway or than a spaceship, right? So you need to bring those details to life relevant to both the setting and the action that the characters are experiencing. Because a setting isn't passive. It's the characters have to interact with it, and that could be as simple as when you were mentioning the sci-fi spaceship type thing. If a shuttlecraft is landing onto a planet and it's got anti-grav, then maybe everyone feels the vibration from the grav plates intensifying as they descend through the atmosphere, and that's just enough. You don't need any more. You don't need to go into a big technical description of it, but there's a sensation that's being described there, which is more than just a visual that gives you that. If characters are trying to talk to each other and they're in a nightclub, there you go. There's setting. It's not passive.
Yeah,
It's interactive. Yeah.
Although Saba might be a character.
And now we know that Alida has a stress ball that she squeezes rapidly if you're listening on audio and you've got no idea what that is. Of course, we know.
Yes.
But it's a cat.
Come here, Saba. A cat.
Very good.
Oh, no.
Cat.
Pet.
A cat.
Yes. I thought you said cat.
Yeah. But that's a great example, where richness is added to the setting by something innocuous, perhaps.
Right. Right. Yes. Richness or an intrusion, depending, but even that can be an intrusion to your characters can add richness for your reader, so that idea of keeping your setting active, not passive, don't let it be a backdrop. We all move through our world and we're affected by it, by the weather, by the noisy neighbors, by the congestion in the traffic, by the cold air conditioning in the library, by whatever it is. And those are sensory details you can make tangible, not only for your character, but also for your reader, and then use them to set mood. They might foreshadow, they might just enhance the scene. If your character is feeling lonely, being in a cold, isolated setting will enhance that by bringing mood. Or you might juxtapose by being lonely in a crowd.
I've done. I can remember many years ago sitting on a beach in Sydney, and it was beautiful weather, and I felt completely alone. It was crowded, it was packed with families having fun, and I was just thinking to myself, why am I not having fun? Why am I not happy today? That's very interesting. And you wouldn't do those without any reason for it in your story. You wouldn't, just do because I want to give this character some depth, but you want to do it, as you say, because it sets that scene's mood, or it foreshadows, or it adds to, it intensifies some conflict. And if you think about the obvious one that is often used in thrillers, where all of a sudden we come to the climactic sort of, part just before the end, and the storm breaks out, and it's raining, and there's a fist fight, and you'll just see it time and time again. But even though that might be the heavy-handed way of doing it, it's illustrating the point, which is setting is going to interfere with your characters at some point.
Right. And it just makes sense. I mean, if you write it in a cliched way, it will come off as a cliche. But sometimes you just need the storm to build as we near the climax, and you need it to erupt as we get to that kind of action. And it can increase the stakes by increasing danger if you're slipping in mud, or there's lightning all over the place, or, whatever it happens to be, and that can add to the terror that the reader feels on behalf of the protagonist during that climactic moment.
So do you think people get setting confused with world building?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think people focus a lot on world building, which is the pre-writing work you do in order to understand your setting. But then the setting is the stage of the page. It's where all of the drama plays out. It's where your characters live and, live through your story. And that setting is going to change as your characters move through the world that you've built, and that's the thing we interact with. So...
yeah, your world building is the encyclopedia, and your setting is what makes it to the page. Because you always know way more than sitting in the scene.
Yes,
and therefore setting is not just description.
No.
Although that's obviously a part of the skill in bringing setting to life. And I think the idea that... have you read Mary Buchan's book? I think it's called Writing Active Setting. That's a very it's very specific to bringing your setting to life as effectively almost as a character, and taking it from just being a backdrop, as you say, to something that brings life to the story, and gives the reader more a richer vicarious experience, as opposed to just through the eyes and ears of the character.
Right. It needs to be interactive, and if you think of some of the role-playing computer games that people engage in, it's not Pong. You aren't just like walking across a blank screen and then whatever the game is, shooting people, I guess, or but think of all the buildings and the corners and the cars and the whatever different settings people have to go through, and how critical those are to the experience of the game. So you need to give not only your characters, but also your reader that immersive kind of experience. That's what makes a world so exciting. That's why Harry Potter has a theme park, because people want to go immerse themselves in that setting.
It's interesting that in the movie world that sort of rich part of it seems to come almost last. And I went to we've just had a Marvel exhibition down in Brisbane, so it's about an hour away from me. And apparently, I think it's the first Marvel exhibition in the world or something, because we just had Thor filmed in Brisbane, and Thor Ragnarok, that is. And so they've got lots of set pieces and things to put on display. So there's over 500 Marvel objects, and so I went there with my daughter, and it was fabulous. It was fantastic. One of the interesting things to see is how they go from storyboarding through to then rendering that first into basic animation, which they have some software for. Then they 3D render that, and then only at the end do they really bring in all the CGI and the green screen backdrops and things like that. And so if you think about it like that, I suppose from a story point of view, getting our setting in place at a wireframe stage when you're sort of plotting it through, or even if you're a pantser, you know, at least thinking, how is the setting interacting here? Because all they've got is just the basic, you know, wham bang pow action scenes, or, you know, a little sketch of they're approaching a big castle and there's a throne in there, but it's just it's just some, you know, black and white scrapes on a piece of canvas. That's all it is. They have not gone to great detail, you know, fitting that all in. And then only towards the end will the director sometimes say, okay, I need some keyframes to just illustrate what we're going to shoot here. And then that's when you get the rich art. They employ an artist to then come in and do a static keyframe, which is a depiction of a particular sequence or a particular moment in the movie that they can then say, okay, this is how I want the mood to look. So he or she can then give that to the lighting director and the camera stagers and the people who produce the sets. So I think sometimes as authors, if we get muddled up with world building, you can sort of spend all that time creating the sets and forgetting that it's the story that has to play on the front of that set, and people aren't going to read a book just for the set, although they might end up, when Harry Potter's made, loving the set so much that they want to go into a theme park in it. But you're kind of not starting with that first, you're starting with your story first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, whether you start with the story or this world building first, they're both pre-writing work. Like the process you were describing with the movie, I would consider all of that pre-writing. I would consider that storyboarding. You know, because when you're actually writing the story, you need your set to be dressed. It's like the difference between rehearsals when actors are wearing their street clothes and they're maybe using black boxes and just folding chairs on the stage and a couple of hand props, versus the dress rehearsal versus the performance, when everything has come together, everything is painted, everything is lit, there's, you know, musical cues if it's appropriate or whatever. So by the time you get to, you know, not the first draft, however many times you revise, by the time you're midway through that process, your stage should be fully dressed and developed for your audience and also for your characters. Like, don't just say they went and got a coffee at a cafe. Is it a Dunkin' Donuts? Is it a Starbucks? Yep. Is it the local shop on the corner owned by a mom and pop who love their neighbors and create a dog-friendly atmosphere? And you know what I mean? Like, bring us into the world, or you create a story that's generic. Don't have a generic story.
That's right. And even if you're not naming things, you know, they followed the path down to the river. Okay, well, down, is that down specifically descending, or is it down, you know, euphemistically just because I'm going there? How narrow is the path? Are there trees either side? Can I see the sky from there? You know, is it a gravel path? Has it been made with rocks? You know, there's lots of things you can just drip in there that give that great sense of realism, I think. And I know that as a newbie writer, I made those mistakes. I was way too vague, and I thought that I had enough in there because I was terrified of being too slow with my descriptions and you know, over describing every leaf on the tree and leaving people bored. But you can be fast, but still, as you say, drip in enough specificity that it makes it appear realistic.
Right. Make it interactive, you know? Think of how you move through your day and what you notice. And there's a lot that blows by us that we don't take in because we're preoccupied or distracted or whatever. But there's enough that we do notice at any given moment to bring a world to life in a story, you know?
Yes.
So Save and I went to the farmer's market and it started raining, so I felt the raindrops on my head and had to determine, is it worth bringing a jacket or not? You know, I walked around and noticed like a little kid backed into me as we were standing in front of a stall. So you don't need to describe the entire scene in lots of detail, but if you pull in just a few telling details to create a sense of place, that's all you need. So that's kind of, find that balance point that's appropriate to your story's pacing between boring the readers and being generic.
Yes. And I suppose it's worth mentioning that there'll be people like me who don't put enough in and have to go back and flesh it out in revision. There'll be people who in first draft put too much in. So it's not, there's no hard and fast rule about, yes, you've got to go back and add this stuff in. You might be going back and taking things out or tightening it.
Yeah, definitely.
So know your strengths when it comes to setting. Oh dear.
Yes.
Yeah. Still working on that one.
Kathryn, any words of wisdom?
No, I feel like that was very well said, Robert, and you gave us a lot to think about, especially with the 3 senses and the 5
Filters.
types of people.
Yeah,
that was pretty cool. I'm going to take that into my revision phase.
Excellent. All right. On that note, we are wrapping up this week's Storyworks Roundtable. I'm sure there will be more on setting at some point in the future. It is such a big topic. We hope you enjoyed the show, and please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.